Okay, so I think we'll get started now as it's 4 minutes past. So today we're joined by Lds Sales Guarantee and Assetz Capital to cover the understanding and tackling key challenges for SME house builders. So from Lds Sales Guarantee, we're joined by Mark Roberts, and from Assetz Capital, we're joined by Mark Standley and Jonathan Witter. I'll let you present.
Okay, so I will introduce myself. My name is Mark Roberts from LDS. I'm going to pass over at the moment to Mark Standley, who's going to take us through net zero and looking forward to sustainable housing.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, Mark Standley with my colleague Jonathan Witter. So as if it wasn't enough dealing with rising interest rates, high inflation, threat recession and labour supply shortages, the government have come along and hit us with changes to Part L of the building regs, which came into effect in June. So this is all part of the government's commitment to bring down all greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2050. And the building reg changes to Part L, which came into effect in the middle of June, make a decent step towards that if they're achieved, with an ambitious target of reducing CO2 for dwellings by 31%. We were debating this morning, and we're pretty sure that it applies to plans approval subsequent to the 15th of June. Trying to be certain in terms of when it would apply. And there are some fairly significant changes, which probably if I ask Jonathan to run through them.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, so as Mark said, the Part L has stated some fairly significant changes to the building regs. The aim is to reduce overall carbon emissions by 31%, as Mark said. This applies for both domestic and non-domestic properties. Non-domestic new builds have to lower their emissions by about 27%. So there is quite a fairly big onus on the domestic element of the construction industry. The main changes really relate to such things as new metrics for measuring energy used within for each property. It's called primary energy, which is the term they've used, which is a new metric which applies to the efficiency of buildings and their heating systems. The U values for things like insulation have also been required to be increased. So insulation for domestic properties is going to have to be more substantial. New heating systems within existing properties will also have to meet the new regs, and they will become electric and have limits on or targets on flow rates. So flow rates of 55 degrees are required for all new systems, and that's both existing domestic and new properties. Another element is Part S of the document also requires that new housing must have the capability of having a charging point, and as we understand it, that's not necessarily the whole sort of element that actually connects to your car, but the capability. So it has to have a cable that comes in effectively, and the attachment will depend on your vehicle. So, but that needs to be put in for all new housing as of 15th of June, and for the 15th of June in 2023, literally every property will have to meet these requirements. So it's a fairly big impact for SMEs, and it will not only add to their cost of construction, which is not welcome in the light of recent cost inflation in any case. So it's going to be a fairly hefty burden.
Thank you,
probably just a general coverage there.
Yeah, and it then sort of comes to strategies for mitigating what is an additional cost. Great inefficiency equals additional cost. Obviously, that can be blended with conventional construction, or going down the sort of modular type route, which is something that we as a funder have got appetite to fund. We've funded modular projects in the past, but it's new skill sets, new methods of construction, and something to really something new to get used to again in the flow of things. Moreover, supply chain issues. Some of these companies are not substantial, as we find with timber frame. Not all timber frame companies are very large. That brings risk to off-site payments, etc., etc. But we need to find strategies to make the best of it. And the nature of the world is that change is a constant, and it brings challenge and opportunities. So if we can get this right, then it potentially puts you ahead of the field and could confer advantages over others.
And just to add to that, as well as in addition to those elements that Mark's just mentioned, there are issues as to whether MMC, modern methods construction, are being fully absorbed by developers yet, because they're still in their infancy in a lot of cases. Things like structural insulated panels and so on, that when costing up, the costs are fairly wide and a full spectrum of costs is there, so it's difficult often for QSs to identify costs on these modern methods of construction. Nevertheless, they going forward, the idea is that they do provide a more rapid method of construction. It's supposed to be cheaper, but from schemes that Mark has been involved myself, we're not sure that is necessarily the case. They're supposed to rely on a lower level of skill, which will help us speed up construction because of problems with labour supply. This can actually help in terms of the overall smoothness of the development process. So the other final point is just the life cycle costing of some of these elements of new elements of construction. We're still not quite sure what is the life cycle of some of the sort of things like SIPs and laminated construction panels. They're being used, but what are the life cycle costs? How long will they last? Are they effective cost-wise? So that's as a question mark over that. So for the main part of the construction industry, the traditional methods of construction are still being used at the moment.
Thank you. Mark, across to you. Microphone, Mark. It's usually me.
Thanks, Mark. So the key driver for any developer when they're looking at any development scheme is viability. And the first thing that they can look at doing this is an appraisal, which essentially will drive any lender's initial decision. And at the top of the agenda on the appraisal is the GDV. What are the houses going? What's the stock going to be worth? Look at comps in the area. Look at the pound per square foot, and then the costs. And the costs break down consisting of many things: the build costs, which Mark and Jonathan just got into there somewhat, the finance costs. Now, obviously, as interest rates are rising, there's going to be increase in the finance costs for developers to consider. That there's also the land cost, the professional fees, the planning fees, and it's what the impact of the interest rates has on not only cost but also potentially profits for a developer when they're looking at a scheme, because interest rates will always have an impact in terms of the borrowing costs. But what would the potential impact be on the GDV of a project, which, as the interest rates start to increase, which we've seen slowly over the last couple of months and the forecast to continue for the next 6 months, what will the impacts of that on values and people's affordability of houses on these schemes that developers are looking at? Will the value start to soften? Will the market start to contract? And these are all important questions that developers are going to have to ask themselves and get comfortable with in terms of the risks on the scheme. So obviously, it should value start to fall, then obviously profitability within a scheme starts to erode. And then where can developers make that up? Will we start to see land values soften because obviously we've seen the increase on costs. We've not seen any impact really yet on land values, although I am starting to see that on several valuations that I come across where GDVs are beginning to slightly soften, and that is having an impact with the cost inflation of interest rates and bill costs, and that is also having a negative impact on land values. So it'll be very interesting over the sort of next 6 to 12 months to see how that happens. So we have a product at LDS that's very much aimed at de-risking for developers. We're working alongside Assetz Capital, where we provide a joint offering for developers to totally mitigate their sales risk. So how do we do that, and what are sales guarantees? So an LDS sales guarantee is an upfront commitment to purchase all units on a site at a guaranteed discount, but the developer still retains the autonomy to sell them all on the open market value. This removes sales risk for the SME developers, whilst it also improves the credit risk for development lenders, because they know they have a guarantee. If they lend at a certain leverage, their debt is covered via our sales guarantee. In addition to that, we exchange and we pay the developer a 10% cash contribution, which goes directly upon exchange into their cash flow, and they can use that towards the cost of the scheme in conjunction with the senior debt from a lender such as Assetz Capital. From our numbers and the numbers we do, and I'll go through this shortly, this can typically reduce a developer's equity by up to 67%, which allows them to typically build 3 times more schemes, and they can either that can be via 3 different schemes or a larger scheme that they might not have been able to due to equity constraints. So what's LDS's criteria? We will provide our sales guarantee on any scheme in England and Wales between 5 and 60 units, whether that be houses or apartments, and with a combined GDV of 1.5 million to 35 million. Our maximum GDV that we'll consider on a house is 1 million, an apartment 750. The reason we have to max out of those is the way we're secured via the warranty providers and the Section 1 loss of deposit cover running out at £100,000 per unit. And in terms of our security, we need the developer to have that Section 1 via ICW, NHBC or Checkmate. And also we have intercreditor agreements with Assetz Capital and other lenders within the market where we have an overarching agreement as to what happens in terms of a waterfall repayment, how we get repaid as each unit sells, someone steps into our contract, and how Assetz Capital get repaid. So what are the benefits of using an LDS sales guarantee for house builders? I've just gone into them briefly there, but obviously the main driver is a 10% deposit, which goes in at interest-free and reduces the developer's equity by up to 67%. It allows them to buy 3 times more stock due to the reduction in their equity requirement, and can more than treble their returns by enabling them to do 3 schemes rather than the one they may have done previously with the limited equity. So how does it work in practice? If we look on the left-hand side of this sheet here, you will see there is a GDV scheme of 20 houses, all worth £500,000, GDV at £10 million. The total cost, 7.7 million. A typical lender, such as Assetz Capital, would lend somewhere around 65% loan to GDV on that scheme, allowing the developer a leverage of £6.5 million. So if you come down towards the bottom, that is a total funding cost of 84%, and the developer is left with a house builder contribution of £1.2 million to fund the difference between the lender debt and the total cost of the scheme. If we move on to the right hand side of the page, you'll see an Lds Guaranteed Structure, where again the top 3 lines all remain the same. The lender debt is 6.5 million against a total cost of 7.7. But if you move further down, you will see our deposit release. So we provide our sales guarantee at a 20% discount against the red book valuation on a scheme, which means that we exchange contracts and pay a 10% deposit at £800,000. That therefore increases the total funding from 6.5 to 7.3 million pounds, giving the developer a total funding GDV of 73%, a total funding cost of 95%. And if on the bottom line, you can see the dramatic reduction in the house builder equity contribution from 1.2 to 4 million to 400,000 pounds, allowing the house builder to save that equity to either go on to another project or build a scheme of a larger nature than they may have not been. The developer, what's really important is the developer always retains the autonomy to sell all these houses on the open market and achieve their full 10 million GDV. And we get repaid our deposit as each one sells. Assetz or any other senior lender gets their money repaid on a waterfall basis. And we are purely remunerated by a small fee as low as 2.99% of the GDV as each unit sells. There's no other interest, there's no other costs, that's the sole cost. Okay, I'll pass back over to you now, Mark.
Thank you, Mike. Is my microphone on?
Yeah.
Okay, it's halfway. Okay, so a bit of a look back, look forward, I suppose. So in Q2, I think it was April, there's a survey of FMB members where 95% of respondents expected material costs to go on increasing into Q3 and beyond. 95% of respondents expected materials costs to increase. Just under 2/3 felt that there would be an increase also in wages and salaries, and around 3/4 were expecting to see increases in the prices that they charge for their work. And I think what we've seen looking back is that all three of those things proved to be absolutely correct. But things do change. Guardian were running a story a couple of weeks ago to the effect that builders report their customers putting work on hold due to inflation fears. That could mean that there is less supply of work, which could bring inflationary pressures back to bear in that market. Naturally, there's difficulty in securing fixed price contracts, and it's a similar story for developers. If you're working on, say, 15% profit on cost, it doesn't take a great deal of change to wipe this out unless there's also inflation in the GDV, the house price is going up. But fortunately, so far, this does appear to be a dynamic. House prices vary across the country, but they're typically holding or increasing, which is helpful. More recently, the National Housing Federation commissioned some research in June, and that found that the cost of building new homes is rising by 12.3% in June, and that's well above the reported CPI rate of 9.6% at that time. Interesting dynamic in the marketplace, I suppose. It kind of brings us on to, well, these are realities. You know, what can you do to mitigate those risks, I suppose? So this isn't an exhaustive list, but it's just a sort of stab at some of the things that maybe we should be thinking about. Make sure you're getting the right advice. There's an old phrase in there: make your life easy, put the best people around you. And that certainly applies in development in terms of the quality of the professionals you choose to work with, appropriate for the nature and the scale of the schemes. That can make a real difference. Equally, if we talk about access to funding, a lot of people forget that the funder and the developer have a shared common interest. They both want the same outcome. They want the scheme to be built on time, on budget, and sell well. So, you know, once terms have been agreed, we both want the same outcome. So, if you think in terms of first-time developers, yes, lenders will see that as potentially a higher risk. Some funders won't support first-time developers. We will in the right circumstances, but again, you're looking to see how the developer has mitigated those risks by putting the right experienced team around them to make sure that they can deliver the project. It's not just about getting the money, it's about making sure the outcome is what everybody wants to happen. But in general, lenders will try and be as flexible as they can to help support developers to build more houses. For us as a business, it's central to our values. We see supporting SME house builders as a very important part of our operation, one of the things that we are founded to do. Other things you can do to de-risk what we're talking to our borrowers about at the moment are try and fix what you can. So we are encouraging developers to try and achieve a level of cost certainty, perhaps 30%, which can be achieved by sorting out your groundworks, major acquisitions such as steel, timber frame via contract packages at the beginning. Also borrowing costs. If you're borrowing over a base rate or similar metric, well, that will track the Bank of England base rate, etc. At the moment, was it 3-5 year SONIA, about 3.5%. So basically the market expects continued rises at the Bank of England base rate. Some lenders, ourselves included, will fix those rates for you throughout the development. So imagine the bill could be over 18 or even 24 months, multiple loan drawdowns over that period of time. They can be locked in actually at point of entry. And in some cases, before you draw the first loan, we'll typically seek to hold a rate for 3 months or so from that initial commitment, and it can make a pronounced difference. We're also asking developers to consider contingency. You'll often see a 5% contingency. Is that realistic against the inflation rates that we've seen and perhaps may be to come? If you have strong liquidity, you've got other revenue flows and you can support it, then that may be fine. If you are dependent wholly on the funding line to complete your project, then maybe a more substantive number is appropriate. We have some first-hand experience of that when we were working with the government CPIL scheme, where we, for a variety of reasons, required an additional contingency, and actually it proved to be a lifesaver, really, in terms of the supply chain disruption and inflation that we saw. Our developer borrowers went through that in really good shape. And sales runoff period, at the moment, markets seem to be strong, houses are selling well, but maybe an additional provision of time to make sure you exit, or indeed, wrapping that into a scheme like LDS, which actually gives you a sort of backstop position for unsold units, may be a reassurance that you need. But Jonathan, in your travels, I think you were seeing potentially some coming off of inflation. I know we can't necessarily draw a line out.
Yeah, that's true, actually, yeah. I mean, not just on the ground, but if we look at the ONS figures for construction prices for July, the rate of increase has reduced very, very slightly. That's encouraging, and you could say that that's a slightly delayed picture of what's actually happening. And as Mark says, on the ground, we're talking to the developers. We're already hearing from them that prices are easing a little bit on some elements of construction. Steel's coming off a bit now, but concrete, timber still plateauing at a fairly high level. But what's another interesting element to the overall construction costs is the fact that labour costs now seem to be a concern coming through rather than materials costs. And most of the sites that we're visiting, there are not just issues regarding possible increases in labour costs, but also availability of labour as well. So that those are sort of snippets from what we're seeing on the ground. But there is some hope on that horizon, because cost inflation does seem to be easing somewhat, and we've had several studies showing us that although it's difficult to crystal ball gaze, tender prices and overall construction costs will ease somewhat next year, and we're pretty much at the peak in terms of growth of prices. So going forward, we're hopeful that that will continue, and we're just keeping a very close eye, obviously, on things such as labour supply and cost as well, which adds to the SME's overall development cost.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Jonathan. So moving on to planning now, and the SMEs and the impact planning has. So earlier this year, the Federation of Master Builders did a survey of SME house builders, and it came back that nine out of 10 SME house builders felt that planning is the biggest obstacle to increasing housing delivery. Why is that? And that's a question that we could probably all sit here all afternoon debating, and that there are so many reasons why. But it just seems that planning is so pragmatic. It takes so long for simple decisions to be made. Is it unfair that a council has prioritised a larger scheme because it's easy to make housing targets where they can approve 250 units on a 7-acre site? Is that easier for them to do a smaller scheme of 9 units for an SME house builder? SME, what planners fail to realise also is SME house builders don't have their own architects, their own planning consultants in house, which these larger national house builders all have, and they can deal with that. National house builders can use a land bank and basically hold land, and so the cost of them isn't as impacted, because they can buy land with a view to holding it and adding value to it, where SME house builders struggle to do that because they don't have the equity. Do they want to take that risk in terms of carrying that asset for 2 or 3 years whilst planning is awaited? And it's not just achieving the planning. Once planning's achieved, there's still then hoops to go through, such as reserve matters and things that quite frankly SME house builders become so frustrated with. The lack of engagement from councils, the lack of timescales put on things, points of contact, and it's all so frustrating. So I mean, what improvements are required? There could be so many, but for me, the most obvious one is more delegated powers within the planning departments of local councils, particularly on smaller schemes, where the planning consultants have been out. They understand the scheme, they understand the developer. It should be a far smoother process. Could local councils release more brownfield sites where the planning isn't quite as regimented, it isn't quite as strict, and there should be more delegated powers within that. The other things, obviously, also there's an appeals process that the developers that have no sight in terms of timescales. It just goes into an abyss within a planning department, and it's not dealt with. And we've got a scheme at the moment where a developer's going through it, and they have no clear sight in terms of where it's up to or dates, and it's just frustrating. And SME house builders can't afford to be carrying sites, paying interest, where, as we've highlighted earlier on in this presentation, interest rates are going up, costs could potentially increasing. So all this time, the viability that an SME house builder based their decision on 6 months ago has dramatically changed. So it just needs, the whole planning system needs a full referendum, a full revamp, and how that's done. It will be very interesting to see how the government and local councils do that going forward. And then just to finish off, what we've done is we've actually put a little test. It's almost like a case study that we have done in conjunction with Assetz Capital, which was a scheme in Ramsbottom, which is in Lancashire, which had a GDV of just over 5.3 million, 15 homes. It allowed us to release nearly 425,000 to the developer, and this was done probably about 16 months ago. It's now coming to fruition. It was in the days of initial CBILS with Assetz. It allowed a developer which had limited cash equity contribution to do a scheme that they might not have been able to, and it also allowed Assetz to do a scheme that they were sort of on the fence with, because it was at the initial stages of COVID, where were sales going to be. So it transformed viability for both the developer and the lender in terms of allowing a scheme to be brought forward that may not have been. We're nearly at practical completion with them. Developers sold, I think, about 95% of the units on site. Sales are due to start in the next month. So it's just, I just thought it a good time to sort of bring the Assetz and LDS product to life, and it just shows how, working collaboratively, we can bring forward development schemes that may well have been missed. And then to finish, I think we're all open to any questions from the floor.
Any questions, you should be able to put them in the question in the chat and we'll pick them up from there. So we've got one question from an anonymous attendee. Will LDS do a guarantee scheme on a part built development?
Okay, so what we say is there's certain we are in no means a one size fits all criteria led organisation. We will look at every individual scheme on its own merits. There will be some very important questions that we will be asking, because obviously key elements are particularly how we're secured. So who is the warranty provider on it? Is it one of our approved warranty providers? What's the reason for wanting to put us in on a part complete scheme? Has there been an unforeseen cost overrun? We need to get comfortable with that. But yeah, we have done it and we will do it, but there's certain things that we need to be comfortable with.
And then we've got another question, which is generally how much more / less is the sales GT to METZ, MEZZ?
Okay, so I think that's probably around the cost comparison of ourselves against MEZ. We are very similar. I would say we're currently almost identical, but if you look at a scheme that goes above 18 months, we become considerably cheaper, because obviously the MEZ burn carries on throughout the whole sales process, and the interest is generally compounded. So the longer you go beyond an 18-month build, the more expensive mezzanine comes in comparison to the sales guarantee. But also with the sales guarantee, you've also got a guaranteed exit at the back end that certainly gives you the extra comfort.
Additionally, it reduces the complexity for us as a lender. We don't need to procure intercreditor agreements. We've got an established understanding with everybody else in terms of how the scheme works, so it could potentially reduce your legal costs and perhaps get things done a little quicker.
We've got another question, which is what is the minimum LDS percentage fee chargeable on unit sales?
So if a development sells out, or as long as we have not been called upon to purchase any of the units on a scheme, if we have our deposits repaid in full within 18 months, the fee is 2.99% against the GDV. And if it goes beyond 18 months, that fee is 3.49% of the GDV on the scheme.
That's great. I don't think there's any more questions for now. Give it a couple of seconds. Some might come from people. I think that is all the questions we may have. Well, thank you to everyone that attended today, and I hope that it was what you were expecting, and that any questions that you had were answered. This is recorded, so it will be in the members area of the NFB website, and we will provide a copy to LDS themselves to share amongst their partners, and I hope that everybody enjoyed the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.